Hi, founder fans. Thank you for coming. Hi, TJ. I see you made it early this evening. Thank you so much. And thank you for everyone who's coming to hang out. Welcome to Founder of the Day, where I am just finalizing some details and rolling up my sleeves. As everyone rolls on in, I'm just going to remind us that this is Founder of the Day. I will be discussing the last 7 founders, according to my website, founderoftheday.com, where I publish 5 new articles a week. I reuse some old ones on the weekends now. Call me lazy if you want. But I do publish those in my email list and on Facebook and Twitter. So follow me on any of those. If you want the old timey weekend ones, or just go to the archives and scroll through them. Approaching 900 articles at this point after 2.5 years. So knock yourself out. Have a good time. Let's get right into it. So today, the first founder, I want to remind you, last Thursday was the Constitution Day. Now, I know the last Thursday feels like forever ago, especially in our modern circumstances, but I assure you it was. And not only that, oh, wrong one. Still getting the feel of fancy stuff. But in honor of Constitution Day, I wrote about Edmund Randolph. Hi, Matt. Sorry you come in there. Edmund Randolph. So Edmund Randolph is an extraordinary character. Last week's article focused specifically on his, as I call it, his love-hate relationship with the United States Constitution, as you can see here. But I want to take you a little bit more through his life. Now, Randolph played kind of a minor role in the American Revolution itself. He did By the time of the Constitutional Convention, or as they called it, the Philadelphia Convention, Edmund Randolph was only 34 years old. But he was already governor of Virginia, the wealthiest and most powerful state in the Union. Mostly because he came from an extraordinarily wealthy family, but either way, he had an extraordinarily high rank. I'm going to stop using the word extraordinarily now, but he had a very high stature in Virginia society. As I said, at 34 years old, he was governor of Virginia, and that's when he was sent to the Philadelphia Convention, where it's famously James Madison kind of orchestrated the United States Constitution, or what became known as the Virginia Plan, which set the Constitutional Convention in motion, and everything else happened based around that. Actually, though, the Virginia Plan was known to the delegates as the Randolph Resolutions, because Edmund Randolph, who was a very good speaker, well, he spoke in Madison's behalf, and he also had a lot more prominence than Madison had. Now, when they showed up, you might think, why didn't George Washington say anything? George Washington was quickly elected as chairman or president of the convention, so he didn't really say anything or make any motions for most of the time. But the first order of business, once they settled these parliamentary details, Edmund Randolph was acknowledged by Washington, who knew this was coming, and Randolph stood up and spoke for a very long amount of time and laid out each principle. He did acknowledge that the framers of the Articles of Confederation did a very good job for the situation they were in, and with what they had, but certain repairs needed to be made. And he's essentially the one that not only said we should remake the government entirely, but he put forth the plan of proportional representation in both houses, laid out a very similar structure of government to what we ended up with today. This took many people by surprise there, and they spent this summer hashing out details. As I do continue to discuss in this article, you'll notice that there's a heading here. He refused to sign the Constitution, and I'll bring myself back up because we're going to go off script a little bit and talk about a little bit more of his life. But Randolph spent the entire summer of 1787 in Philadelphia hashing out the details of the United States Constitution. And then when push came to shove and it came time to sign the United States Constitution, Edmund Randolph was one of only 3 people who stayed around for the signing who refused to sign it. Now, there were several reasons for this, but he didn't like the vague power that was given to the Congress. He thought Congress should be very specifically tasked with certain details, and he didn't love everything about the presidency. And most importantly, he wanted there to be a second convention. He wanted, after the states ratified, for there to be a second convention that the states could now send delegates to hash out amendments, instead of just hoping for amendments to be made when the first Congress met, or having separate states make their ratification dependent upon certain amendments. He said, why don't we just say we're going to have another convention? If the states ratify, they can send a representative to discuss making amendments to this document. And he was outvoted then. And he decided, well, I just can't put my name to this document in that case. My constituents wouldn't like it. So he goes back home to Virginia, and they call a ratification convention. Now, about 35 years old, Edmund Randolph is still governor of Virginia. So when the ratification convention comes together, well, who's the chairman of the Virginia Ratification Convention? Edmund Randolph. And he's sitting there and he's quiet for a good portion of it because he was a federal man. As I said, he's the one who proposed this whole idea in the first place. So he was for most of what the Constitution was saying. But now that he had not signed it and admitted his grievances publicly, he was a little bit more open to some of the conversations. And he did come around and end up becoming one of these people who said, you know what, I think I'm going to support it. And he actually does talk to some people about his support, and he becomes one of these few important founders whose decision to change his mind and support it led to Virginia ratifying the Constitution. It was extraordinarily close. I don't remember the exact numbers, but I might be wrong, but I'm pretty sure Virginia voted 189 to 179 to approve ratification of the Constitution. So it was about 5 or 6 people out of 300 that really swung Virginia to support the United States Constitution. Even if my numbers aren't exactly right, I'm close. It was about 10 votes. It was 10 votes. It's amazing. And because Edmund Randolph supported this, he gets a lot of credit for swaying people one way or the other. Although George Wythe also does. Not to throw him out like that. George Wythe deserves a lot of credit for a lot of things. Anyway, so that's where my article ends. But I did want to bring up, after this, George Washington becomes president. What do you know? And he recruits a cabinet. And the first person selected as the first Attorney General of the United States of America is Edmund Randolph, who's still only in his late 30s. It's a very important task. And, Attorney General, as a position that's supposed to uphold the laws for the federal government, he set all the precedents of that department. It's incredible. And then he goes on to become, when Thomas Jefferson resigns, he becomes the second Secretary of State of the United States. He takes over for Jefferson as Secretary of State for over a year and a half, almost 2 years. During this time, unfortunately, he's the one who, I shouldn't say unfortunately for him, he's the one who signs the Jay Treaty, even though Hamilton and Jay were the ones who really worked it out. But as Secretary of State, he signed the paperwork, so he got a little bit of blame for that. But he also communicated with the French. Now, he was communicating with the French minister in Europe, and he apparently said some things about how Washington and Hamilton didn't like France and the revolution going on there. And a letter is intercepted by the British that's given to Washington that says, hey, someone's saying stuff in your cabinet about private cabinet meeting things. Somehow the French found out about. And Washington at a cabinet meeting confronts Randolph about it and says, did you write this letter? And he looks down, and Randolph resigns immediately and hangs his head in shame. Now, by all indications, Randolph was a really good guy. He just had some lapses in judgment from time to time. And his communications with the French were obviously one of these. He doesn't appear to have done it maliciously, he was a Washington supporter. He was a Federalist man. Again, he sided with the Federalist Party. It's one of the reasons he got the job. Unfortunately, he does resign here, and he goes back to private life and kind of fades from the spotlight, having accomplished more by the time he turned 40 than most human beings accomplished in their entire lifetime. There is one more of note thing. Later on, when Aaron Burr is accused of treason for trying to invade Spain, or Spanish Mexico, Edmund Randolph, who had gone into private practice, is one of his defense attorneys. And I'm not going to harp on that too much because Aaron Burr and impeachment trials comes back up a little bit later today. So that's a brief overview of Edmund Randolph and what I like to call his love-hate relationship with the Constitution. I'm going to pull up my Friday's article. It's an anti-federalist article. I made a fancy one today because, see, we got Robert Yates, and then whammy, we have John Lansing. And these gentlemen are the first anti-federalists, in my opinion. This is my opinion. Now, I wrote this because I've been doing the Anti-Federalist Fridays, and kind of again, Constitution Day was this week, which is a big deal for those of us who live our lives in the late 18th century, like I do. Now, Robert Yates and John Lansing are a really interesting team. They first came together as partners, actually as teacher and student. So Robert Yates was a successful Albany attorney, and John Lansing was a young man studying to be an Albany attorney, and he went under Robert Yates's wing. And they kind of come up together because of this. Yates was from a middling background and become successful, and Lansing came from a little bit more wealthy background, but under Yates's guidance, also became successful. And during the Revolution, they mostly stayed in New York, doing New York things, as many founders did stick to their state. Now, at this point, I want to remind you that when the Declaration of Independence was voted for in July of 1776, they wanted unanimous vote. So every state voted for declaring independence, except New York, who abstained. New York was not the biggest or most populated or wealthiest state or colony during the American Revolution. But by the end of the American Revolution, and even going into it, it looked like that's where things were going. And the reason New York abstained from voting for the Declaration is, well, first and foremost, because they had not received updated instructions from their state yet. These gentlemen, as I like to say, were very tied to the instructions they received from their state. They considered themselves statesmen. They were not acting on their own behalf unless they were given the instructions to do so. So something like declaring independence from your country, Great Britain, you needed very specific instructions for that. But the reason New York took so long is they were independent. Granted, Britain was about to invade and sailing up to their shores, literally the might of the British Navy. But New York always had this kind of bipartisan area. I know it's hard to believe today, but New York was a bipartisan area, and we're going to get to that. So this is the background of New York when Yates and Lansing go to make some adjustments to the Articles of Confederation at the Philadelphia Convention. And then they show up, and Edmund Randolph stands up and starts talking about this entirely new government. And from Yates and Lansing's perspective, they're like, we were not told to do this. You're trying to have a coup. You're trying to overthrow the government. Like, they were not very excited about it, especially because, as I was saying, New York was growing and growing and growing in power. And Matthew's asking, who in the state gave the instructions? So the instructions would come from the state assembly. So each state did it differently. For example, we actually are going to talk a little bit later about Titus Hosmer and how, like, Connecticut, for example, would get together. They'd have a bicameral, what's called meeting of the state house and state senate would have a joint meeting and make decisions like sending delegates to places like that and writing up instructions. As for New York, off the top of my head, I'm not sure exactly which body made it up or how they met for these particular delegates. I'm under the impression that they were, it would have been put together, if I'm remembering New York's politics correctly, then the New York Assembly would have made the decision on the instructions, and they would have been sent to the Senate to approve. Almost the way financial bills work in the modern United States Senate. Most states work that way. Connecticut was a little bit different. Most states work that way, and I'm pretty sure New York worked that way too. I will look into that and double check and make sure I'm right about that. I'm not 1,000% sure, but generally that's how it would go. That's how I know that's how they would elect their delegates for sure. Is they would be chosen in the assembly and then set up to the state to be not ratified, but approved by the state senate. So anyway, Robert Yates and John Lansing are approved by New York State and go to the Constitutional Convention. And there they are, and they're looking around going, what are these guys talking about? So they stay there for 6 weeks, and actually Robert Yates took extraordinarily good notes, and it's a shame that we only have the first 6 weeks of his notes until he left, because other than that, we only have James Madison's firsthand notes to rely on. Everything else comes after the fact from people's reflections. Because the Constitutional Convention, they swore themselves to secrecy so that people could say things and not be embarrassed, and so that other people didn't find out and say, you guys are trying to overthrow the government, which, like, they were. In an essence, there was ratification. I get it. Buddy Tom likes to call it a coup. But the two delegates from New York, well, there is a third delegate from New York called Alexander Hamilton, who, was from the Caribbean and spent a lot of time out of New York during the war. But we're not going to get into my opinions on Hamilton in this particular situation. Robert Yates and John Lansing look around and say, this is garbage. And they leave the Constitutional Convention. They are the first delegates to leave based on their opinion on what's going on. And they go back to New York. Now, they don't immediately publish and break the vow of secrecy, but they do break it and tell Governor of New York, George Clinton, who had at this point been governor for almost 15 years and will continue to be governor for a long time and eventually be vice president. But they told George Clinton, and they're like, dude, like, they're trying to rewrite the government. And again, as I was saying, New York was already powerful, and all signs pointed to yes, if you're talking about who is going to be the most powerful state in the future. The harbor of New York was an amazing port. Everyone knew it. Going up the Hudson was perfect. There was already ideas about canals, although this is a little early before the actual Erie Canal was really being discussed earnestly. That being said, Robert Yates and John Lansing go back to New York, and they're like, this is crazy. And Governor Clinton agrees with them. And therefore, they start attacking the Constitution. They do wait until it's published, but as soon as it's published, they're already ready to go. That's why when James Madison and John Jay and Alexander Hamilton start writing the Federalist Papers, they write them in New York and they publish them in New York, and they are almost all addressed to the people of New York. The Federalist Papers are addressed to the people of New York because of the 3 delegates that went from New York. Hamilton, who was still young and like not everybody's favorite, was never everybody's favorite person. He comes back, and Robert Yates and John Lansing are like, no, like, we're New York. We're number one. We are going to dominate the whole world eventually if you let us. And so they go back, and they become major anti-federalists. So, and let me make sure I'm saying the right names, but they become anti-federalist leaders, and I am going to talk more specifically about the Brutus letters. Robert Yates ends up writing his disagreements, and he writes most, if not all, of the letters of Brutus, and Brutus becomes one of the most important anti-federalist writers. Tons of what he writes. In fact, much of what the Federalist Papers are written, most Federalist Papers are written in response to anti-federalist papers, and a lot of them are written in response to Brutus. And we think it's him for several reasons: writing style, things of that nature, but also because his firsthand knowledge of what was going on at the Constitutional Convention. And as for Lansing, he used his tongue. He joined with Melancton Smith and became one of the leading spokespeople at the New York Ratification Convention against ratification. And again, New York, like Virginia, was decided by less than 20 votes. It was super close. We like to look back and be like, yeah, the Constitution was written, and everyone was like, yay, party time. And it's like, no, it was close. But New York, much like Virginia, both ratified after, Virginia was just Virginia's after New Hampshire. I should look that up, but I know for a fact New York, living in New York, I know for a fact it was after New Hampshire had ratified, and it was kind of futile to fight it at that point. So that's the story of Robert Yates and John Lansing. Lansing actually, 30 years later, I mean, this is the 1780s, like 30, almost 40 years later, kind of goes missing. He leaves his hotel in New York City and disappears. I should have put a link to that. I do have an article about that on my website. Maybe we'll talk about that sometime this week. The vanishing of John Lansing. But he goes on to be, if I'm not mistaken, a Chief Justice of the New York Supreme Court. Really high level guys. They're not nobodies. They were sent to the Constitutional Convention. They were the ones trusted with amending the Articles of Confederation to make it better and to help improve a federal government or a confederated government. So when they came back so upset, people took them seriously. That's why they wrote the Federalist Papers, as I said, because people were taking them seriously. So we're going to move on and take a sip of water. Guess who this guy is? Did you guess Henry Brockholst Livingston? I'm sure you didn't. That's who it is. Henry Brockholst Livingston. So this is one of the weekend articles. I'd written this one a while ago. Henry Brockholst Livingston came from the Livingston family. His father was William Livingston, who went to the First Continental Congress, was at the Second Continental Congress, but was one of the many people who left early because they saw independence coming and went to their home state to take care of things at home when independence happened. And William Livingston, his father, would be governor of New Jersey for 20 years, much like George Clinton in New York. He was governor of New Jersey for the whole revolution. His sister also married John Jay. Sister Sarah Livingston Jay married John Jay, who I went into great detail last week, you might have seen. I did skip a little bit. So much like the person I spoke about yesterday and James Madison, Henry Brockholst Livingston was at Princeton when it shut down briefly during the American Revolution. Now, some people like Madison waited it out and went back. Other people, like Benjamin Hawkins yesterday and Henry Livingston, like we're talking about right now, when the school shut down, they joined the army. And Brockholst Livingston became an aide-de-camp to Philip Schuyler, who was one of the highest-ranking major generals in the Continental Army. So nothing to snuff at. He did eventually leave Schuyler to join the lower-ranking officer of Benedict Arnold, who at the time was already a hero in the Continental Army. He was a hero to everyone for a while there. And then Henry Brockholst Livingston was serving at his side at the Battle of Saratoga when Benedict Arnold really became an American hero. He really was. And I know that's hard to hear, but that's what made his treason so important, is he was a hero. Everyone who supported the Patriots loved Benedict Arnold, except for a few people in Congress who kind of screwed him there for a while until he went and treasoned. But my point is, Henry Brockholst Livingston was serving there. Now, after Saratoga, he does go back and he studies for a little while, tries to increase his education, and then he goes to Spain. His brother-in-law, John Jay, goes to Spain as minister to Spain. Henry Brockholst Livingston joins him there for a while as his personal secretary. It was a great opportunity for a young man to travel to Europe, where education was seen as better, and to get this experience in diplomacy, though he would never use that because he went into justice. So he sails back from Spain. His ship's actually captured on the way back from Spain, and he is luckily it's in 1782, so the Yorktown's already happened, the war is all but over, and he was coming back from a diplomatic mission. So the British held him for 3 weeks and then released him because they were like, what are we going to do with this guy? What's the point? They release him. Now, he makes his name in a very important court case. You may have heard in the play Hamilton, this is the first court case of our new nation. And that is bad timing because it's at the end of Act 1 when the court case was really in 1802. But the court case of Levi Weeks is famous because Alexander Hamilton and Aaron Burr were the defense attorneys for this man who was a man named Levi Weeks, who was accused of throwing his fiancée down a well and murdering her. Now, you may know that they did a very good job as defense attorneys and got him freed, whether or not he murdered her. No one was ever charged with her murder afterwards. It's a real O.J. Simpson scenario. Either way, they get him off. But what you may not have heard is there was a third attorney working on this case. His name was Henry Brockholst Livingston. And Henry Brockholst Livingston was just as important as Aaron Burr and Alexander Hamilton to winning this case. Now, of course, the case is more famous because these two dudes would shoot each other not far in the future. But it was important for Henry Brockholst Livingston, who was proving himself at this point. Again, this is 1802, so I did skip some time. He came back from Spain, was a lawyer for about 20 years, and then did this case, and he finds himself appointed to the New York State Supreme Court. And because I'm probably going to screw these names up, I am going to bring it back up here. There was a very interesting case called Pierson versus Post. And I bring it up because there are two names with a P and I confuse them a little bit. But here's how it goes. This guy Post was chasing a fox. He was hunting. He was out there hunting, wanted some fox. So he's chasing a fox, trying to hunt him down. This guy Pierson sees the fox run in front of him. So he runs up and he chases him down and he shoots the fox and starts skinning it. And Post comes up and is like, hey man, I was chasing that. And Pierson goes, you snooze, you lose. And he takes the pelt and he leaves. So Post sues Pierson. Believe it or not, this case goes all the way to the Supreme Court of New York State. Not the United States, just the New York State Supreme Court. But it's still very important because, first of all, the court ruled in favor of Pierson, the guy who actually got the fox, because they were basically saying finders keepers. Like, this guy got the fox, he killed it, he's walking away with it. But Henry Brockholst Livingston wrote the dissent. And what's very interesting is two things. First of all, he says, well, Post should have had it because he already was chasing the beast. So, like, if your dog runs away and goes to your neighbor's house and your neighbor picks it up, is that his dog now? No. It's, this guy already claimed the animal. And furthermore, and very, very interesting from my perspective, is Livingston said there's a code among sportsmen that the person who was chasing the fox had, according to the hunter's code, so to speak, it was his fox. You got to let him finish the hunt. If he gives up, you can kill that fox. But it was this guy's fox. Now, from Livingston's perspective, this hunter's code was as good as common law. And now common law was and still is a legal argument in certain cases. You hear the term common law spouse, for example. So he was saying, according to common law, no, this was Post's, this was this Post gentleman's fox. Now, again, this was the dissent. He did lose the case. Either way, at this point, Mr. Brockholst Livingston has made a name for himself, and he is elected to the United States Supreme Court. He was chosen by President Thomas Jefferson in 1806 as an associate justice. However, for the next several years, while he's on the court for about 10 years or so, he ends up siding mostly with John Marshall and Bushrod Washington. So John Marshall and Bushrod Washington were on the Supreme Court for a very long time. They were the last two Federalists in the federal government. They were appointed by John Adams not long before he was done, and they sat there together for 30 years. So when Jefferson chose a Chief Justice, and I'm just realizing the irony of saying this during modern political times, when Jefferson chose a Chief Justice, he expected that he would vote more associated with the Democratic Republican Party. It turns out that Henry Brockholst Livingston was actually more in line with himself and his own conscience, and he did end up siding with John Marshall and Bushrod Washington on most things. But that wasn't so much from his partisan politics, because that wasn't his party. That was because when he was interpreting the Constitution, that's how he also read things. And again, as I pointed out, so a gentleman who was not afraid to dissent when important decisions were being made. So let's leave Henry Brockholst Livingston. I'm going to take a sip of water. I do see Matthew is helping us out here. I was right about Virginia and New York coming after New Hampshire. Thank you for confirming that for me. If I'm not mistaken, Virginia was a few days after New Hampshire. So yeah, thank you, Matthew. You're the best. While I'm taking a sip of water, I do want to note something real quick. I meant to do this at the beginning. I do want to give a shout out to John Adams at Liberty Cigar Company, who I interviewed a few weeks ago and was nice enough to send me a box of cigars, the Founder Series. And I am just going to show you because I can't wait. I can't. If you're not a smoker, I apologize. But these are I mean, the box is engraved. It's a little humidor. I'm not going to hold it up forever, but there are 13 cigars after 13 founders. Go to liberty.com, libertycigars.com. And I also want to throw this out. This is my, I've been reading this book a lot. I don't know if any of the articles I wrote this week are from it, but some of the ones I did last week and I didn't have it on me, so I made it the book of the week because I talked about it a lot last week. Jefferson's Treasurer, how Albert Gallatin saved the new nation from debt. This is basically, Albert Gallatin's basically the guy who took over for Alexander Hamilton as when Jefferson became president as his Secretary of Treasury. And while Jefferson was trying to destroy Hamilton's handiwork, Gallatin was there saying, we can't really get rid of it. We can try and make it not so bad. He's an amazing, amazing person. The book is a little bit lawyery, or maybe I guess I could say maybe accountanty. Some of the words are a little big, even for me. I like to consider myself having a fairly robust vocabulary, but you know, if you get through it, it's incredibly informative, and I'm reading it right now, so read along with me. A bunch of people saying things. Tina F. I am not a teacher. This is a hobby. I'm a fan. I would call myself a student of the American Revolution well before I call myself a teacher of it. I just really enjoy it, and I'm happy to share it. I would have loved to be a professor. To be a professor, generally speaking, you need a PhD, and I did consider that for a while, but I'm a grad school dropout. I decided to give up on that and work for several years, but I kept reading the whole time, and here we are decades later. Matthew, it is very nice. I took some pictures. I will post them on Instagram. Follow me on Instagram if you want, though I put out more information on Twitter and Facebook. But Matthew, you know that. So let's look at another American founder. This guy is a lot of fun. His name is Samuel Chase, and it's another Supreme Court one. And it's Congress impeaches Samuel Chase. So I'll bring myself back up here. Samuel Chase. Oh boy. So he was a fiery young man who made a lot of enemies. And somehow, even as a young man, he got the nickname Old Bacon Face. I'll pull him back up for you. I mean, this picture is from when he was a lot older. But I don't know. He doesn't look that bacon facey to me. Right? Okay, either way. So old Bacon Face is causing problems in Maryland, but people seem to like him, and they send him to the Continental Congress. And he actually signs at the first Continental Congress. He signs the Continental Association. Then he goes back to the Second Continental Congress, where he is happy to sign the Declaration of Independence, because he was calling for independence from Britain early on. He's one of the first guys to do so. He was actively against staying with Britain. Unfortunately, he does some shady dealings because he uses his Continental Congress insider information to corner the flour market in Maryland. And people realize this, and he's taken out of the Continental Congress, and he has to his reputation's hurt for a while, so he has to keep a low profile through the end of the war. But after the war, he ends up being sent to England to talk to London about repaying the debts of loyalists, because that was part of the agreement when the revolution ended and the peace treaty was signed, is that loyalists would be able to keep their property, and that was tough. But he went to speak on behalf of Maryland for that, and he went to speak about bonds, Bank of England stocks, and how Americans who held stock in the Bank of England would be funded. I don't even want to say refunded. Like, would they get to keep their money? It was a tough situation. So he went there and helped smooth that out. When he came back, his reputation was restored, and he was appointed as a judge in Baltimore. And he would make his way up throughout the 1780s and become a Chief Justice of Maryland. That being said, I do see a question coming in. I do not, Matthew, believe he is related to Salmon Chase. I have looked that up in the past. It was a long time ago I looked it up. But no, I do not believe he is related to Salmon Chase in any fashion. I might be wrong because Salmon Chase is a little bit out of my usual studies. And I did look it up probably 10 years ago. But no, I do not believe they are related because I didn't go out of my way to look it up. Oh, but how time has passed. Anyway, thank you for asking. So Samuel Chase, now you got me saying salmon. Samuel Chase, uh, he is an anti-federalist because he's naturally against things. He's just a man after my own heart. um, not, he's a contrarian, and he likes to be against whoever's in power at the time. um, so that being said, he does soften up a little bit and become a supporter of it's called a pro-administration party. So during the the ratification of the Constitution, there's the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists. And then when Washington becomes president, the Federalists become pro-administration party for a quick second, and then they end up becoming Federalists again. The Anti-Federalists become anti-administration very quickly, and then generally become the Democratic Republicans. However, when they went from ratification to Washington's presidency, there were many people who were anti-federalists who became pro-administration and later federalists. Not so many people went the other way. I was thinking about that before I turned on the camera, so I wanted to bring that up. And Samuel, you got me, Matthew. You really got me. Samuel Chase did become pro-administration and supported George Washington, and that was a good idea because at the end of Washington's second term as presidency, he nominated Samuel Chase for Associate Justice on the United States Supreme Court, and he was approved. And then things got a little tough because, well, Thomas Jefferson becomes president. And Jefferson's administration doesn't love all these Federalists in the Supreme Court, especially after the whole Marbury versus Madison thing goes down, and they decide that they get judicial review. The Supreme Court gave itself the power to interpret laws as legal or not, according to the Constitution. Samuel Chase, well, not only was he one of these Federalists, but he was a little bit more outspoken, as we've learned in his life, and he would talk politics to the people. He was also kind of a jerk about things. So he was an easy target. And the Jefferson administration attempted to impeach him for being indecent. He was acting indecent is the word I had to look up. Now, this was for several things. Cases involving trials of people from the Whiskey Rebellion, and even more importantly, the Fries Rebellion, which is an unheralded uprising in eastern Pennsylvania of Germans who were not happy with taxation, and people charged under the Alien and Sedition Acts. So because of not only his decisions in these cases, but his talking trash in public about these cases, they attacked him. Now, he did get impeached in the House of Representatives because when Jefferson became president, the Democratic Republicans also swept into power in the House of Representatives. Also in the Senate. However, the Senate was a little bit more cautious because he gets impeached, as we've learned too many times in the past 2 decades, that the House will impeach someone and then they go to trial in the Senate, and then the trial can convict them or not. So at the trial in the Senate, he is the presiding judge is the president of the Senate. And just to remind you, at this point, the president of the Senate is a man named Vice President Aaron Burr, who was about 6 months removed from killing Alexander Hamilton, who was the leader of the opposition party. Technically, Aaron Burr was a fugitive in both New York and New Jersey. He ends up taking this case, I believe it was in Richmond, Virginia. So he's cool there because dueling isn't so bad down there. And he oversees this case of the impeachment of the trial of the first impeached justice of the United States Supreme Court. Man, I wish someone would make a movie about this. Anyway, Aaron Burr, by all accounts, is very unbiased in his judgment and his presiding. Now, it's my understanding that in most cases, the defendant in any case was kind of innocent until proven guilty, but kind of presumed to be guilty. And Aaron Burr, for all the trouble he's given historically, in this case was supposedly very even keeled in handling everything. And because of that, the vote was close because you need a 2/3 majority in an impeachment trial to remove someone from office, and they did not get the necessary amount of votes. I believe it was 25-9, and they needed 23 votes because there weren't a lot of people in the House of Representatives at this point. I mean, yes, Vermont and Kentucky had hopped on board, and actually Tennessee and Ohio, I think, at this point. But not that many states and not that many people, so not that many representatives. Two from each state. Senators is how I should say it. Either way, unfortunately, or fortunately for our hero, Samuel Chase, he is not impeached, and he does remain on the court for another 6 years till the end of his life. And this has an amazing impact on the history of the United States and the Supreme Court in particular. The Samuel Chase, I see Troy commenting on Old Bacon Face. It is a fantastic nickname. Now look, you guys are getting me today. I can't. The impact of the Samuel Chase impeachment is tremendous because Samuel Chase not Samuel Chase, the Supreme Court has proven, and the United States Senate has proven, that justices will not be removed for light and transient causes. They'll only be removed for serious things. Acting indecently in your public opinions does not count as a reason to remove someone who's supposed to be appointed for life. And that's a gigantic effect that trickled down, especially, like I said, just a few years after Marbury versus Madison. This is the formation of the United States Supreme Court. It's giving it its power, and this trial gives it its independence. That's Samuel Chase. I see you guys laughing at Old Bacon Face. I mean, it's a winning name. I don't know how. I can't disagree. I'm going to take a quick sip of my water if you don't mind. And we're going to go because we're 43 minutes in. We've only done 4 out of 7. Don't worry. It gets a little quicker here. We're going to talk about George Washington as a businessman for a few minutes. This is a picture of the James River and Kanawha Company. Now, I do have to note, this comes from later. I had trouble finding an image of the James River Company. It later became the James River and Kanawha Company. And forgive me if I'm pronouncing Kanawha wrong. I've only ever read it. I've never heard it said. And forgive me if I'm pronouncing James wrong. I have a lot of friends named James, and I don't care about whether or not I'm saying their names wrong. Anyway, I actually only have one friend named James. Congratulations on your baby, James. George Washington, businessman. So, we all know George Washington as, maybe the great commander-in-chief who led America to victory in its war for independence, or maybe the great commander-in-chief who was the first president of the United States of America. What we often overlook is James... not my night, man. With names, it's not my night. What we often think of what we often overlook about George Washington is George Washington was first and foremost a businessman. And yes, he owned a plantation with lots and lots of slaves. That was a business of his. But that's not it. Although I will say, when the war started, George Washington and many of his contemporaries, one of the many reasons that they wanted to throw off their king was because when he was exporting his products, he was not getting a fair shake for several reasons, with the taxes and the Currency Act. Controlling the American currency hurt a lot. Many things. But he was a businessman. He always wanted to retire, after the war. And then after 2 terms as president, he wanted to retire to his home. Not just because he wanted to sit around and do nothing. No, he invested in dozens of businesses throughout his life. Now, this article is about just one of those. The what they called at the time the James River Company. Washington, as a young man, made his name as a surveyor, and he surveyed around Western Virginia and the Ohio Valley and Western Pennsylvania. There were border disputes and whatnot. He did get his hands on a lot of land out there, but he also realized, as I said earlier, how important canals were going to be, especially to the western parts of Virginia. Now, again, this is a point in time where, Western, Western Virginia is now West Virginia and Kentucky and Ohio and parts of Pennsylvania and like perhaps everything to the Pacific Ocean, depending on which founder you were asking at the time. But they knew that the Mississippi River was going to be important as Americans moved in, or colonists before the war, as they moved inland. Eventually, they would need to use the Mississippi River to trade. And what Washington, as many wanted to do, they wanted to connect the uh, Atlantic Ocean to the Mississippi River through their state, not through other states, because Washington did look at the Potomac, but he would have had to go through probably a little bit of Maryland, and he didn't want to do that. They wanted to keep this Virginia money. So he found that the James River goes far enough in and the Kanawha River goes far enough out that if you use the right set of canals, you could connect the two and essentially ship products either way. It would have been a huge financial boon, not just for the state and not just for the farmers out west growing products, but for the investors. And George Washington, again, he invested in many land companies, but this one was close to his heart. And he actually brought up the idea in before the American Revolutionary War, but didn't actually organize the company until 1785 in that retirement he had. So the first retirement between the war and the presidency. So he organizes the James River Company and puts it together. Unfortunately, it's very slow to take off. They do start building canals, but there's setback after setback, and it just takes forever. Eventually, they start calling it the James River and Kanawha Company. And by the 1780s, 20 years after Washington's death, it still really hasn't made its money. And now suddenly it's competing with the Erie Canal, which won for all intents and purposes. The Erie Canal won as far as canals in North America go. Well, yeah, the Panama Canal, that's not North America, right? It's in between the two Americas. Anyway, it won the 18th century, or 19th century. Top of that, railroads show up. And actually, the James River Company, after it changes its name to the James River and Kanawha Company, ends up investing heavily in railroads. And all the land that had been purchased by Washington and the other original investors ends up being ceded to in the mid 1800s, in the 1870s, actually. And I've read past the American founding, but this company ends up ceding its right-of-way lands to railroad companies. But it's a very interesting. Its failure is interesting. It's one of many companies Washington invested in, and one of only a few that actually outright failed. Although, again, it outlived him by a long time, so it's hard to say it outright failed. It's probably not how I should put it. But now you know about the James River Company, one of many companies that George Washington invested in. I'm not going to spend too much time on it, but I did bring it up because I actually wanted to talk about this gentleman, Andrew Moore, not Alfred Moore. Alfred Moore was on the Supreme Court. Andrew Moore. Excuse me. And I bring up Andrew Moore because, well, I had kind of written this article about him, but then thought, you know what, if I'm going to be explaining these videos, I should write about what the James River Company is first. So I did. And I don't know. Also, for my readers, I wanted them to get that background, so when I put a link to the James River Company, they didn't have to click it. They could just know what's up. Either way, let's move on to Andrew Moore. Two more founders. We're almost done. Andrew Moore studied law under George Wythe, who I mentioned before, educated tons of founders at the the College of William and Mary. He started a law practice, but that was just a few years before the war broke out. He fought in the Continental Army for a while as an officer, and then became joined the Virginia militia. I'm going to take a time out. I did see a question come in. I kind of ignored. I think 2020 is volatile, but those first years of the Constitution seem wild too. Yeah, it was pretty intense. I'm not going to get too far off topic this one, but yeah, the Anti-Federalist debates, it wasn't even the first few years of the Constitution so much as the decision to accept the Constitution. We think of it today as it's the Constitution. Of course it's there. It's right. It's infallible. But no, people were very unhappy about the Constitution. I think to a large extent, I can't speak to everyone in America in 1789, but I think for the most part, after the intense debates of the ratification process, that once George Washington settled in as president, there was a bit of a sigh of relief. Although I should say, yeah, it ends up getting worse. Once the Jefferson and Hamilton anger is kind of reserved when they're both in Washington's cabinet. But as they both leave Washington's cabinet, you're right, that's when it becomes really public. And who took the brunt of it? John Adams. Sorry, bud. Sorry, man. Just the worst. Oh, John Adams. He just got the worst deal, dude. I always feel so bad for John Adams. I really do. I mean, I'm not gonna go into it today. Maybe I'll do a video on that later. You think he had time fighting against the British after holding ties with them at first? Tina, are you referencing George Washington? Did he have a hard time fighting the British after holding ties with them? No. I think once he had decided to wear his uniform to the Continental Congress when he knew they'd be picking generals, he was perfectly fine with fighting whoever he was fighting as long as he got to lead an army. Now, Washington didn't, there's a common misconception that Washington wore his uniform to the Second Continental Congress because they knew war was breaking out and he thought he'd be selected as commander-in-chief. That's not 100% true. Washington, they did know war was going to break out. I mean, by the time the Second Continental Congress sits down, by the time the Second Continental Congress meets in late April of 1775, they're literally sitting down at Congress, and as word comes, hey, war broke out in Lexington and Concord. So they do know that's coming. Washington does wear his uniform to look spiffy because he knows he has a little bit of a reputation around the United States for some of his earlier work as a military man. Never as a general, as a colonel, but he does have that reputation. So he knows if I wear my uniform, I'm going to get an appointment. This is going to be sweet. Doesn't know he's going to be asked to be commander-in-chief. There were other candidates, and not everyone knew he'd be asked, and there were other people who were not super happy about it. And what's interesting, and the reason I bring this up is people like Horatio Gates and Charles Lee, who ended up being high-ranking major generals in the Continental Army, were not just also former military leaders. They actually served, they were from Britain and served in the British Army, while Washington had only served in the Virginia militia until that point. So no, because there were so many people ready to fight against, who had much stronger ties to Great Britain than Washington actually did as a colonial, no, I don't think he had a very difficult time. He also got to be commander-in-chief, so that's nice. I'm going down in history. So anyway, Andrew Moore, let's bring his picture back up. He's not a great look. He's not nope, is it coming? There we go, found it. It's a little bit blurry, unfortunately. Not a lot of pictures of him around. He was, as I said, he left school to fight in First Continental Army as an officer and then the Virginia Militia. Excuse me. Ooh, a lot of talking today. He would go on to be a congressman. I'm sorry, I'm skipping some things. After the American Revolution, he finished his studies and became a lawyer. He was sent to the Virginia House of Representatives, Virginia Assembly for several years. Ended up going to the Virginia Ratification Convention, supported the Constitution, and then was sent to the United States House of Representatives. He was an inaugural member of the United States House of Representatives. Not a lot of people get to say that. So what's interesting about his story is he was an original investor back in 1782, just as the war was ending. He was an original investor in what was the original name of it? Liberty Hall Academy. He was a trustee of Liberty Hall Academy. Now, skipping ahead years, by the end of the 1790s, Liberty Hall Academy had renamed itself the Washington Academy. It actually still exists today as Washington College, but at that point it renamed itself in honor of the president, Washington Academy. And Andrew Moore's big claim to fame is he had made a lot of friends while he was a member of the House of Representatives, including George Washington. And he talked to George Washington and said, hey, Georgie, we named this university after you. It's an official college in Maryland. And he's like, look, why don't you help us out? Can you donate some finances to help us out. So what he actually did is he convinced Washington to donate 100 shares of the aforementioned James River Company to Washington Academy. And they were still profitable back then. This was before they realized it wasn't going to work out, although it was about 20 years in, and just before Washington passed away. Now, as for Andrew Moore, he would end up going, he sided with the Democratic Republicans. He ended up going and becoming a United States Senator for 6 years during the Jefferson administration. I should also mention that he became a major general in the Virginia militia. He stayed with the militia throughout all these years, became a major general. So, super underrated, very, very, very obscure. You know, I like obscure. Andrew Moore is super obscure, but he did that. I think there's about to be a fire truck driving by. Hopefully he keeps driving. It's not coming here. But I do apologize if those sirens end up bothering us. So let's get to today's final founder. I clicked on that, and it is this gentleman. And I started making some cool, look at that. Look, I wrote his name right on his picture. Imagine that. Oh, I'm getting good at this being on the internet thing. This guy's name is Titus Hosmer. Now, Titus Hosmer, I was shocked to realize I had never written about, because Titus Hosmer is a name that's been familiar to me for quite some time. The reason is Titus Hosmer signed the Articles of Confederation. And if you signed any of the major documents, I've probably read your name dozens, if not hundreds of times. Take a quick sip of water to talk about Titus. Titus Hosmer was from Connecticut. And he, he was just making a name for himself as a younger man. As the revolution approached, he was on a committee of correspondence for in Connecticut. He ends up getting into the Connecticut Assembly, and then he is sent in 1778 for one term to the Continental Congress. Now, independence had already been declared. He went to the Continental Congress and served for a year with a bunch of other Connecticut people. But when, as I was talking about before, Matthew, Connecticut had a joint meeting of the House and Senate to select delegates to the Continental Congress. They selected Titus Hosmer, and they also voted to approve the Articles of Confederation. Now, the other documents were generally signed by the people while they were there. You know, the First Continental Congress, they signed the Continental Association. Everyone there, okay, sign it. Send it in. Declaration of Independence, and they voted for independence in July of 76, and then August 2nd, they decided to sign an engrossed copy. So everyone there signed it. I will say a few stragglers came in over the next weeks and months and arguably year, but they, for the most part, everyone was there that signed it. The United States Constitution, September 17th, 1787. Everyone in the room, except for 3 people who didn't want to, signed the Constitution. The Articles of Confederation were done differently because the states all had to ratify them independently. So what would happen is, for example, Connecticut ratified it in 1778. A few others had already ratified it, and it would be a few years before Maryland would ratify it. But Connecticut would show up, say, we ratify, and everyone who was there then would sign it. As opposed to when it was first written, it's not that everyone signed it like the Constitution. So, Titus Hosmer shows up with 4 other delegates from Connecticut, and they say, hey, guess what? We're in. Articles of Confederation are our bag, baby. And they signed it. So Titus Hosmer gets his name on that document for eternity. And that's really his claim to fame. But he returned after that year to Connecticut, but he had made an impression on his contemporaries. So he was actually chosen as one of the 3 inaugural justices of the Court of Appeals in cases of capture. Court of Appeals of cases of capture is one of the most important judicial courts. I'm talking a lot about justice this week. I guess it's on my mind. One of the most important judicial courts in the history of the United States because it was the first federal court. Under the Articles of Confederation, famously, the Articles had no power over the states except the Court of Appeals in cases of capture, because the Court of Appeals in cases of capture very specifically determined during the war, when someone captured a ship at sea, they had to determine who got that booty. So, the Court of Appeals in cases of capture made the decision as to who was awarded the goods and cargo taken from said vessel. Sadly, Titus Hosmer, who was one of these three original chosen for the Court of Appeals in cases of capture, the first federal court, which for everyone else who served in the Court of Appeals of cases of capture, went on to, if not bigger things, at least a long career of justiceship. Titus Hosmer passes away just 4 months later of unknown causes without ever having heard a case, and really removing his name from history books that he otherwise should have been in. It's very sad. Not what I was hoping for when I saw the name Titus Hosmer the other day, and I was like, oh, I wrote about him, didn't I? I look up, I'm like, how have I not written about Titus Hosmer? And I look into it, and I knew he was on the Court of Appeals of cases of capture, but did not know the tragic ending. So that's your show. Sorry for bumming you out at the end there. If you guys have any questions or comments, that's what I'm here for. I'll take a sip of water. Before you go, if you guys want to hit like on the way out, that helps me more than anything else you could do. I know we have some Patriots here, TJ and Matthew, at very least. If anyone wants to support this channel on Patreon, become a Patriot. I have a bunch of extra content over there. I talked a lot about this setup recently. I'm sorry, guys. I will put out more American Revolution content very soon, I promise. I'm still figuring this out, so if you have a comment about anything, the video quality or the sound, let me know. I'm trying to figure it out. I know the sound's a little tingy. I've been focusing on making the video better. I know the sound's important. I am going to spend probably this weekend improving the sound. I know I put out kind of a crappy video on John Jay last Friday, and I felt bad about it. I was even newer than I am right now, but I felt like I talked for so long about John Jay. It's one of my longest videos recently. I was like, gotta put him in there. Yeah, Troy, I really agree. Hosmer could have been. I mean, it's speculation. Not everyone who was on the Court of Appeals of cases of capture went as far as some of the other guys who was like George Wythe, John Lovell didn't go that far, although he had many children who ended up being important founders. Thank you, TJ. You're the best. Thank you so much. I'll see you next week. Before you guys go, if you are interested, like I said, this book is a link below. I am currently trying to read it. It is thick and not the easiest to get through, but super informative and super interesting. It talks a lot about the arguments against Hamilton's assumption plan. We hear a lot about Hamilton's assumption plan, not a lot about the arguments against. Again, one of the reasons it's hard for me to study Hamilton's financial plan, because it was hard, as this book points out, for the founders to study Hamilton's financial plan. It was so complicated and so convoluted, and one of the main arguments was, why can't anyone figure out what you're talking about, dude? Albert Gallatin did figure out what Hamilton was talking about. That's why he was, by default, the choice of Jefferson to be Secretary of Treasury. And also, again, check out Liberty. I don't have a link. I should have a link in the description. Check out Liberty Cigar Company, man. Their cigars are great. I mean, the box came in this. I don't know what else to say. It's probably going to reflect the lights, but, I mean, whammy. I wish you could look at it. I'm trying. I got a lot of lights on me. I'm glad winter's coming. I won't be sweating by the end of these videos, as I am all summer long, because I have to turn off my AC or it's too loud. I also think I need a new computer because that's making noise. Anyway, I'm all done. I'm going to let you guys go. Just over an hour. Man, try and keep it under an hour for you. The shorter I try and make these videos, the longer they seem to get. So I really appreciate you guys. Thank you so much. Again, if you'd hit like on the way out, I would be tremendously appreciative. I am not sure if I know how to end the stream or not. I have a history of ending it poorly. But I'm going to go. I'm going to give you guys a nice round bottom. And